The Vince McMahon Netflix special just dropped and it's mid. So I've seen a lot of that on social media, and I do feel like if you're going into this thing expecting something crazy, then you'll be disappointed. However, I still think it's an interesting piece of media, and today we're going to talk about it. I'll be giving a brief overview of the documentary episode by episode, and by the end, we can determine whether this was a good piece or just a massive disappointment that didn't go far enough. The first episode was mainly an introduction to Vince McMahon, the person, and how he rose from being some random kid in a family into taking over this company. He bought it from his dad and then went on a complete rampage. For those who aren't aware, the territories were how wrestling operated back in the 60s and 70s. Everyone stayed in their own territories and didn't encroach on others. But Vince came in and took a wrecking ball to that ideology and wreaked havoc all over the territories. He took their talent and wiped them out one by one. It then goes to show how Hulk Hogan became the top babyface and won the WWE Championship from the Iron Sheik. Despite Vince's success, his father wasn't happy with how he was treating the territories. Despite him going like, "Go get him, champ, you go, baby," he wasn't too fond of Vince Jr.'s ruthless ambitions, and then he died. So now Vince Jr. has the green light to pursue his dreams of conquest. How? Well, incorporating celebrities and creating WrestleMania. Despite putting everything on the line, this would be a massive success and catapult this fed into superstardom. Despite this success, the WWE started to get into issues. The John Stossel, David Schultz incident, where some guy was like, "Hey, wrestling is fake," and then this guy named David just slapped the shit out of him. And then the Hogan Belzer interview showed that despite the success, these people are still carny as hell. Alright, overall, this was a very tame, cookie-cutter, surface-level history lesson about Vince and his rise, but the interviews are actually interesting. The second episode starts off by talking about Saturday night's main event and how the company was growing in popularity. However, there were casualties, and the casualties was the health of the WWF roster. It's not like modern times where the talent has guaranteed contracts. These guys in the 80s worked hurt, and if they didn't, then they wouldn't get paid. So the conditions were terrible for the talent, and with these conditions, some wanted change, like Jesse Ventura. He wanted to start a union, but it was snuffed out by Hulk Hogan. Yep, the biggest star who's getting the most money rats out Jesse Ventura, and that's when all hope for a wrestling union died. So if you want to blame someone for that, blame Hulk Hogan. Vince talks about it and believes it was a sham because there's no way that the pro wrestlers would ever unionize, which is probably true because people can be very selfish and only focus on themselves over their constituents. And then we go into WrestleMania 2, which was a complete disaster because Vince wanted to have it across 3 cities. And overall, in terms of pay-per-views, it was a nightmare. But thanks to Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3, WWE was able to rebound from this failure. And at this point, Hulk Hogan was too big and wanted to branch out. So WWE experimented with the Ultimate Warrior as a successor, which flopped more so to Warrior as a person and a wrestler. And they had to go back to Hulk Hogan. WWE then flew way too close to the sun and tried to push Sergeant Slaughter as an Iraqi sympathizer during the Iraq War of the 90s. Hogan won at WrestleMania 7 and everything was fine, okay? It's all fine. Till it wasn't. The special then goes into the steroid scandal. So context, a doctor named Dr. Sahorian would sell wrestlers prescriptions for drugs, which became illegal due to the war on drugs, and got himself thrown into the slammer. This also came around the same time the WBF, the World Bodybuilding Federation, was formed, which was Vince's bodybuilding fed, which is its own separate topic for another time. But yeah, the worst possible timing and arguably one of Vince's biggest flops. Then we get to Phil Mushnick, who was Vince's biggest hater. He was a columnist who wrote negative stories about the company all the time, and his columns about exposing the business would lead to more scandals, like the Ring Boy scandal, meaning adult talent doing bad things to children. What also irked me is Bruce Pritchard, who is a huge suck-up to Vince. Vince also called it a conspiracy, because of course he did. And Vince also might have, sort of, allegedly covered up Nancy Argentino's murder so that Jimmy Snuka wouldn't go to jail. The business also treated women terribly, and Tony Atlas admitted that the boys treated them like toys, which is pretty gross. Another woman, Rita Marie, then accused Vince of sexually assaulting her, and Vince drops one of the most memorable lines of this whole thing. He said, "Even if it was rape, the statute of limitations ran out, so, which is an absolutely insane thing to say. Then, the Department of Justice indicts Vince McMahon, and Side A, aka the Feds, say he's a corporate drug pusher, while Side B, Vince, believes it's a government witch hunt. In the end, Vince McMahon won and got a not guilty verdict, as they didn't have enough evidence to tie him directly to the steroid scandal. But all this bad publicity would hurt the Fed and lead WCW to rise up. It also helps that the owner is super wealthy and powerful. It was better than the first episode, and it delved into some of his scandals, but it's still surface level. Episode 3 starts off with talk about the original Screwjob, where Wendy Richter didn't want to lose the belt, so Vince conspired with Fabulous Moolah to get the belt off her. It then goes back to the steroid trial, where Hogan didn't throw Vince under the bus, which probably saved him from jail time. After all these incidents occurring, it hurt the WWE's image, and Hogan was now in WCW, so they needed a top babyface. They tried with Lex Luger, but he flopped, so Bret Hart, among others, took the reins in leading this company forward. Then the Monday Night Wars began, and Bischoff took the reins. He was completely ruthless and did what Vince did to the territories. This would damage Vince's ego, and he'd get really petty by doing the Billionaire Ted skits, showing that it's like that meme where, you know, I have like the guy wearing a mask and he's crying. That was Vince McMahon during this time. Then it moves into the curtain call, where the Clique pulled the curtain back and exposed the business. While Vince didn't seem to care, since he's the one who killed kayfabe in the first place, the old school heads hated it, and someone had to get punished. Hall and Nash were gone, Shawn Michaels was champion, so Triple H had to eat shit and like the taste of it. However, this caused a massive butterfly effect that we'll get into later. This was also when WCW started to beat the WWF every week, and the company was in dire straits, so what did Vince do? Well, he sued WCW for using his intellectual property. The Netflix special then moves into Bret and Shawn's feud and how they hated each other. Bret got an offer to go to WCW that Vince couldn't match, so Bret was WCW bound. He was the WWF champion at the time and didn't want to lose it to Shawn, so Vince came up with another screw job, just like he did in 1985. Bret had a feeling something like this was going to happen, but the match went on, HBK locks on the sharpshooter, and the rest is history. Bret Hart gets screwed by Vince McMahon, and he's gone. And now Vince McMahon is hated by the fans. It feels like this episode focused too much on like the Monday Night Wars. I was expecting more about Vince himself, but it just felt like a history lesson about what we already know. Episode 4 starts out with Vince talking about a wrestler named Dr. Jerry Graham who influenced his character. Then it fast forwards to 2024, mentioning Vince's resignation, which we'll talk about later. Vince does the Bret screwed Bret interview that makes things worse for him, and then goes into the Attitude Era. In order to compete against WCW, they needed an attitude change. You see what I did there? You get it? Attitude change? You know? So, D-Generation X was born and injected some attitude into the Fed. But the true flag bearer was Steve Austin. The documentary goes into the rise of Steve Austin and then the Austin McMahon feud that elevated the company to the next level. It basically kickstarted the hottest period in WWE history, at least at the time. Then it talks about The Rock and his ascension into superstardom. While this part is just a history lesson, it goes into how this period of WWE offended parents, which boo-hoo, alright? It's not their fault that your child is watching wrestling. Maybe, you know, watch what your kids are doing. Vince also says that the product was family friendly, and Netflix completely contradicts him in real time with footage showing that, yeah, Vince, it's not really family friendly, you know? The documentary then goes into how the product sexualized women at the time, which is 100% true. They did. But it was the late 90s, so they were able to get away with it, but it's true. Their primary audience were young men, so it made sense to appeal to them, and young men love women. Unless you're gay, you know, then you're already getting your sausage fest by watching wrestling in the first place. But yeah, bra and panties matches, mud bath matches, bikini contests, all of it hurt women's wrestling's legitimacy and credibility, and the women weren't prioritized other than sex appeal. It then gets into Owen Hart and talks about how he became the Blue Blazer. It then goes into the Owen Hart tragedy and Vince's decision to continue the show. We can argue about whether the show should have gone on, but Vince gives his reasoning, which is that the crowd didn't see it, so it's fine, which is pretty fucked up. He also said that if it was him that died, then he would have wanted the show to go on, which I think is true. I think he would, because he's that much of a freak. The episode then ends with the lawsuits about the Owen Hart situation getting settled, and another kind of disappointing episode, to be honest. It was just more surface level stuff. Episode 5 starts with Vince talking about how his childhood influenced him to create an environment where he's untouchable and invincible. It's implied that he was abused both physically and sexually as a kid, which is pretty disturbing and could explain things. He also talks about how he doesn't look back, which kind of shows that he had a screwed up childhood and could be the reason he's a monster, which I like this interview part because it does shed light on things that he really never has talked about. And then goes into the lives of Shane and Stephanie and how they became part of WWE TV. Vince didn't want them to be nepotism hires, so he put them through the ringer to earn their stripes. They also talk about the time Steph got drugged into marrying Hunter, and the fans, they chanted slut at her. Oh, why do people look down on wrestling fans? Well, look yourself in the mirror, okay, you geeks. Triple H and Stephanie became an on-screen couple, and Shane was adamant against Stephanie dating the talent, but that didn't stop them consummating the relationship, and they became a couple. Vince, being the freak he is, wanted their wedding on pay-per-view. Stephanie was like, hell no, and Vince told her she's being selfish. Why the fuck is she a carny freak like I am? So, Vince, 6 days before their wedding, he booked himself to fight her on pay-per-view and beat her up. Incredible, Vince. Awesome. It then goes into talking about Linda's life and how she ended up with him, the WWE, and then she became an on-screen character despite her not liking it, which made sense because she had no charisma whatsoever. Like, does anyone really give a shit about Linda McMahon? No. Vince talks about how the storyline with Trish was fine with their family. The one where Linda was drugged and Vince made out with Trish in front of her, and the infamous bark like a dog segment where the fans were cheering Trish stripping down to her underwear, which again is an indictment on wrestling fans, you geeks. But Vince gets sued by Sable for sexual harassment, and you start to see a pattern here with this kind of behavior. Vince talks about the affairs he's had and how it changed him, which is a load of crap. It didn't change him at all. Paul Heyman comes at us with this incredible description of Vince McMahon. I quote, Vince doesn't own the business owns Vince McMahon. And I actually believe this. Vince was completely obsessed with professional wrestling. It was his entire life for 40 years. He didn't sleep or do anything but think about pro wrestling all the time. And the business is all he had. It's really kind of sad, to be honest, when you think about it, that this one man's whole life was built around wrestling. WWE defeats WCW and buys them out for $2.5 million, which is insanely low, and now Vince feels untouchable. But that lasted only for a few months as Vince decided to launch the XFL. It was a complete failure. It got the lowest ratings in primetime cable history, which is insane. In the wake of the utter failure of the XFL, Vince did an interview and the questions hit a bit too close to home, and Vince lost his mind. Pure insanity. But things started to get worse for Mini-Mag. They had to change their name due to the World Wildlife Fund, the XFL died, their hotel casino business failed, they lost their Times Square spot. I feel like this has always been an issue with Vince. Every time he ventured off to do something not wrestling related, it failed. He was good at one thing, and that's pretty much it. Then the documentary transitions into the Ruthless Aggression era. With Austin and Rock out of the picture, it's time for a new generation of stars. Someone with the charisma, appeal, and talent to make it big. And that was Gene Snitsky! You see, he clearly had the talent to become a... Nah, I'm just with you. It's John Cena. And during this time, Vince was deranged in terms of his character. Katie Vick, Kiss My Ass Club, shoving kids down a flight of stairs. But the craziest one of all that never happened was getting Stephanie pregnant with Vince. Don't worry, it's just Vince the character doing it, not Vince the human being. Alright, just don't worry about that. It's perfectly fine. It then goes into Shane's relationship with Vince and how Shane wanted to carve out his own path in life. Shane then left the WWE to pursue his own ambitions because Vince wouldn't let go. It also talks about how the relationship was crumbling and Shane had to get out. He wanted control over the WWE, but Vince was holding on to it with everything in his being. But things were about to get much worse for Vince. Episode 6 starts off with talking about Donald Trump. Before becoming president of the United States, he was a real estate mogul who liked wrestling and was invited to do the Battle of the Billionaires feud. But Trump is an entertainer and a master salesman. Like, wrestlers are tailor-made for politics. If, God forbid, Hulk Hogan, The Rock, or even Vince McMahon run into politics, they'd be very effective at it. Anyways, we then go into the time where Vince McMahon died. On screen, of course. He cut a weird promo, got into his limo, and the car blew up. They really wanted to make this story into a spectacle and convince people that he was actually dead, so this was going to be a massive angle. But then it came all crashing down when weeks later a tragedy rocked the industry. The Benoit incident. At first, WWE turned Raw into a tribute show for Benoit, but details of the incident started to come out during the show about what happened, and this tragedy put the WWE once again under massive scrutiny. It opened up the old wounds of steroids and drug issues in the company. Chris Nowinski comes in and explains the story. What's interesting and depressing is how Chris had to retire due to concussions, and wrestlers thought it was fake, which shows a lot about the business. Nowinski then wants Chris's brain for research purposes, and his results show how much the industry destroyed Benoit. This is where things get crazy. Basically, Vince and Hulk say it's a work. And even dumber is how Steve Austin believes that CTE isn't a thing. I think Steve has had too many Budweisers during this interview. Like, what is wrong with these people? But surprisingly, Vince contacted Nowinski and wanted to work on preventing concussions as much as possible, and positive changes were made to the company. And regardless, the Benoit situation brought in a lot of negative attention to the WWE. Then it talks about how so many wrestlers died so young in this business. And Vince gets really defensive about this and says how he takes no blame for wrestlers' deaths in the company. And Vince once again gets a blind eye turned towards him from the media due to it being wrestling and lowbrow entertainment. It shouldn't be that way, but the media really doesn't give a crap about wrestling. What's interesting is when they talk about the streak ending and Talker, are you kidding me? When Undertaker talks about getting concussed, but Vince is like, nah, it's a work, brother. It was so dramatic for Mark that he doesn't remember. It just shows how these people have such a weird mentality about wrestling. They can't separate fiction from reality because they live in that fiction every day. I know, heavy, right? WWE then shifted to a PG product due to advertisers and sponsors. They wanted brand-safe products, and the Ruthless Aggression era was not it. But they lost those fans. They changed, and they also changed how they presented women's wrestling. Stephanie pushed women's wrestling hard, and while Steph and Hunter gained power more and more, Shane was left out in the cold. But then he came back and got his comeback moment, which is very cool. All Shane wanted to do was make his dad proud of him, and he finally got that recognition at Mania 32. It also talks about how Vince was a father figure to the roster, which explains why the roster is so defensive. It's the 2010s, and WWE became more profitable and successful than ever before, despite it not being the 80s or late 90s and doing it through shady business deals. Vince has conquered the industry and had a death grip on the company. He never wanted to retire ever. He would have died in the chair, and everyone believed that it would have taken something massive to bring him down. Well, in June of 2022, Vince was taken off his pedestal. In a New York Times article, it was revealed that Vince had an affair with a woman and tried to cover it up with hush money payments. Then he came on SmackDown when this broke as a view to this story. At first we thought nothing would happen. I mean, this guy survived so much, there's no way he'd leave. Well, 1 month later, Vince released a statement saying he was retiring and leaving. Unfortunately, when this went public, Vince went into hiding and canceled all of the interviews for the documentary, and we thought we'd never see him again. But he weaseled his way back into power in 2023, committing a hostile takeover and ripping away control from Steph and Hunter. He then decided to sell WWE to Endeavor, and now the company was now owned by a non-McMahon. But why? Probably for a big payday, and also he was going to be overseeing TKO Group as its owner. While things looked good, or at least acceptable for Vince, everything would come crashing down on him like a bonsai drop. January 25th, 2024, the day Vince McMahon's grasp on WWE came to an end. The scandal that finally ended his 9 lives. Another article by the New York Times revealed the details of this suit, and holy crap, it's diabolical. I've learned over the years to not be surprised by this guy, but oh my god, this was awful. It was just stunning how disgusting this was. Just depraved and awful. And a day or so later, Vince resigned from TKO Group and sold his shares in the company, finally ridding the WWE of Vince for good. This also indicted Brock Lesnar and Johnny Ace, who no one gives a f about, and caused him to get yeeted out of the WWE as well. Once this domino fell, so many other stories about Vince's behavior started to appear that I won't get into here. And Vince McMahon's legacy and position in the company has been irreparably damaged. Despite the allegations, WWE is doing the best they've ever done in terms of business, proving that WWE is bigger than its owner. And that's where the miniseries concludes. Overall, I thought this documentary was well made, and I liked the interviews, which gave a lot of insight from the talent and Vince himself. However, I feel disappointed in the fact that this was more of a history lesson than about Vince himself and his issues. They talked about him a lot, but it focused too much on WWE lore like the Monday Night Wars. Although I feel like this miniseries wasn't made for me or you, the super fans, it was made for the non-fans and casual fans who know nothing about Vince McMahon or the WWE really, which it succeeded in doing if that was its goal. For us, this was already no knowledge for us hardcore fans. I'd personally recommend it, especially for people that don't know much about wrestling and Vince McMahon as a person, as it gives a good synopsis of it all. But it's very surface level stuff, nothing too crazy or unknown, and it does fluff up Vince a bit, which isn't great. Anyways, that was the Vince doc, and I might do another video talking about the scandals of Vince McMahon in the future, where we get into all the nitty gritty details about his life. Anyways, thanks for watching, and bye bye.